A Guide to Custom Passenger Lists, 1820 to about 1891, and we'll get into why it's about 1891 later on. What is a custom passenger list? Well, a custom passenger list is a list of passengers submitted to the collector of customs at the port of entry in response to federal legislation passed on March 2nd, 1819. These passenger lists are the very first federal government documents that document the arrival of immigrants to the newly formed United States. With the exception of the federal census, they are probably the greatest genealogical treasure trove of the 19th century and furnish evidence of arrival at various ports and port of entries into the United States for nearly 20 million people. What we're going to talk about today is how they're organized, the background history, how they came to be, various immigrant ports, and most importantly, we're going to talk a little bit about tips and tricks on how to find your particular immigrant ancestor in these lists. So this gentleman whose portrait you see over here to the right is one Representative Thomas Newton of Virginia. Thomas didn't do a whole lot in his multiple years in Congress, but what he did do is incredibly important for genealogists. On March 2nd, 1819, he passed a law, an act to regulate passenger ships and vessels. This was done in response to truly horrific conditions aboard ships. One particular incident had seen over 700 passengers out of about 1,267 passengers die aboard the ship from a variety of diseases and just general poor treatment. I think it's important to remember that these initial federal customs passenger lists are generated not out of a desire to keep track of immigrants in any way, shape, or form. This is strictly a humanitarian proposal. The primary function of this law was to ensure that for every 2 tons of weight a ship had, it could only have 1 passenger. Unfortunately, as far as humanitarian sentiments go, it didn't do a whole lot immediately to alleviate these terrible conditions aboard ship because it took the tonnage as a whole instead of the tonnage in the steerage department where the vast majority of people would be living while they crossed the Atlantic. And so you would still have a lot of folks jammed into too small of an area. But throughout the 19th century, there will be updates to this law, and it will include such radical acts as requiring a certain amount of ventilation aboard ship, letting people occasionally go up on the deck to breathe fresh air, things of that nature. However, the law of unintended consequences holds strong because part of the way they enforce this law is they demand an enumeration of all passengers aboard, beginning in 1820 at every single U.S. port or port of entry. Now, I should note, in addition to other consequences, while this probably remains more of a subject of debate or conversation in regards to Irish or Canadian genealogy, one immediate effect of this law is that getting a ship to the United States from, say, Great Britain or Ireland now becomes increasingly expensive because of this law. Britain, on the other hand, where huge numbers of immigrants are coming from both the British Isles and Ireland, it's about 5 times cheaper to take a ship to Canada. And so that's why you will see huge amounts of people going to Canada and then finding their way to the United States, which was their goal all along. So how did this process work? The law is pretty basic. 6 categories must be recorded: the name, age, sex, and occupation of the passengers, the country to which they belong, and the country to which they would like to belong. So this image you see right here, this is the customs house in New Orleans. This is a relatively recent structure and was finished in about 1903, but it gives an idea of the importance of customs in these various port cities. You know, what are customs? Well, customs are an agency responsible for collecting tariffs, which are tax on various imported goods, usually at the place of entry, which for most of human history has been ports. It's hard to overestimate how important customs collections was in the United States. And in fact, before 1913, with the introduction of the very first federal income tax, customs provided over 90% of the federal budget. Let's talk numbers. So during this time period, this is where large-scale immigration to the United States really starts to take off. From about 1820 to 1840, slightly north of 667,000 immigrants arrive in the United States. But between the decades of 1840 and 1860, you see a relative explosion with over 4.2 million immigrants arriving. The year 1854 alone sees close to 500,000 immigrants coming in 1 year alone. These numbers, while having various ups and downs, if you look at it a year by year, as the 19th century ends and the early 20th century begins, the numbers just keep going up. Where are they coming from? So Ireland, Great Britain, Germany, and Scandinavia are where the vast majority of immigrants will come from in these years. Other groups include Canadians, including many British and Irish immigrants that take advantage of the much cheaper passage to Canada. Although I should note in 1846, in response to the horrific famine, Canada will finally be able to include its own version of a passenger law, which means that basically the price of a ship between the United States and Canada evens out. They'll take advantage and come across the border. Chinese begin arriving in relatively small numbers on the West Coast. Smaller groups of French, Dutch, and others continue to immigrate in this period. One of the most important things to keep in mind is where they're leaving from. Far and away, the biggest immigrant ports in Europe at this time are Liverpool, which is where you see the vast majority of Irish and British immigrants coming from, and Bremen, which of course is in the European mainland in the heart of Germany along the Weser River. That's where you see most of the continental arrivals leaving from. In fact, this image right here is a drawing of Bremerhaven, Bremen's port along the River Weser. Other ports include Le Havre, Amsterdam, and Rotterdam, which tend to have larger numbers the earlier that you look at them. Le Havre, Amsterdam, and Rotterdam's passenger traffic was interrupted by the July Revolution in France and the Belgian Revolution in Belgium. So it has a real impact on people leaving from there. Why are they coming? Well, many historians talk about a push and pull factor. The push factors are things that make you want to leave. The pull factors, of course, are things that make you want to come to the United States. One, the European population of this time period is absolutely exploding due to a combination of better sanitary conditions, medical technologies, which ensure the mortality rate is not what it was even 10, 20 years before. You add in large numbers of American crops like, probably most famously the potato, and you can support a lot more people on the same amount of land. However, you also have this problem now where the inheritances for land, say in Germany, are getting smaller and smaller as they have more and more children. Of course, probably most famously, you have disasters such as famine, the most famous of which, of course, is the Great Irish Famine. However, it should also be noted that the potato failures were not limited strictly to Ireland, but were also somewhat more widespread in Europe as well. So depending on what time period you're talking about and what area, you'll see surges in German immigration, for instance, in response to potato failures as well. The Industrial Revolution is beginning to get its start, and it begins displacing traditional artisans, many of whom are relatively well-to-do and have no desire to take a step back in life. And so immigrating to the United States starts to take on a rosier glare. Religious and political freedom in the United States attracts both groups and individuals. And of course, finally, the possibility of success in the form of cheap land or money, particularly in regards to higher wages here in the United States. Where do they land? Now we're getting into the nitty-gritty of it. So there are 5 big ports we have to talk about: New York, Baltimore, Philadelphia, Boston, and New Orleans. The vast majority of immigrants in this time period will come through one of these 5. And when I say vast majority, I mean over 95%. That being said, everybody's family story is different, and there are 75 other ports that immigrants can come through as well. But the only ports that really have any, like, more than a few hundred people are Mobile, Alabama, New Bedford, and Newport. But generally speaking, when you're looking at where your immigrant ancestor would have landed, it's going to be in one of these 5. So this is an example of an original customs passenger list. It's fairly straightforward, but let's take a look at some of the details here. This is a ship from out of Liverpool, pretty common. This John Rathbone up here is solemnly and sincerely swearing that this is a complete list or manifest of passengers that he has taken aboard his ship. Now, I will note that you will see the phrase captain or master used interchangeably, and they just mean the same thing. So when a captain goes into a port, in this case, New York, he has to go to the collector of customs, and he has to sign this in the presence of either the collector of customs or, more likely, given the sheer amount of business that's going on, one of his deputies. And of course, you can see here, you've got the 6 bit important categories that the law says you have to have: name, age, sex, occupation, the country to which they belong, and the country to which they intend to become inhabitants. I should also say one small note: it will not be until about the 1870s that the laws will change, that they will only have to document immigrants. Prior to this, you will see a listing of everyone on board this ship. So if you have an ancestor that you think may have traveled for business purposes, somewhat unusual, but not out of the realm of possibility to say between like the United States and Great Britain, they will be listed on here as well. Because once again, the idea behind these is not to keep a record of immigration in any way, shape, or form. It's a humanitarian gesture to make sure that, you know, the people coming over here will, to be blunt, survive the voyage. The wonders of bureaucracy. There will be differences in these forms. There is no standard form. Ships would go from port to port, and they would actually buy pre-made forms, and they can be all over the place. All the law specifies are those 6 categories that we mentioned. That's it. That's all they have to have. Anything else is just a quirk of the printer in question. Now, many of the original customs passenger lists that we will be talking about have not survived. But that doesn't mean that there's not some records out there, because there's a process that the passenger list will go through at the customs house that, fortunately for us, means that while many lists were destroyed by various events that we'll talk about when we get to the individual ports, other records were generated from them that enable us to know largely the same information. And the first of these will be a copy. Many of the original lists were taken and they make a copy of them. And the copy will usually give, besides, of course, the 6 categories required by law, it will also include the name of the vessel, embarkation port, arrival port, usually the name of the captain, and the arrival date. From there, a copy would be put together with a quote unquote abstract, which is usually a quarterly assemblage of the passenger list for a particular port or customs district. They will usually contain the quarter year of arrival, 12 months in a year, 4 quarters of 3 months each. And in turn, the State Department prepared these as transcripts for Congress. However, because of the sheer amount of immigrants coming in by 1832, Congress said, please don't send us these anymore. And instead, they would have the customs collectors send statistical reports and nothing really individual. The transcripts themselves will have gaps, omissions, and errors, but they do cover areas for which we would otherwise have absolutely nothing. And I should note, a transcript is almost always just simply a copy of the abstract. About 9 published volumes were created and eventually microfilmed, which we'll talk about that when we get into how these lists were preserved later on. But Volume 2 disappeared at some point before 1960 and has never been found. So depending on the port that we're going to talk about, supplementary records will fill in these gaps. So let's start talking about that. But first, I want to show you an example of a copy and an abstract. All right. So this is a copy taken from the Port of Boston. And you can see here, it gives you pretty much the exact same information that you would expect from an original customs passenger list. But if you note off to the side here on the far right, you'll see it's a little bit different because it's a different form. It even includes the part of the vessel occupied during the voyage, which, while perhaps not super helpful in terms of a genealogical point of view, is good because it gives you additional information about your family. So that's a copy. This is an abstract. This is an abstract from the Port of New Orleans during the second quarter of 1845. So if we look here, it starts breaking it down, the dates, the 6 required categories, in addition to, it's just, think of it as a very large compilation. Why do they change from customs to immigration lists? In 1874, the law changed so that officials no longer had to send in individual lists to the State Department, but just statistics, just in the same way that by 1832, they didn't have to send full transcripts to Congress. In the late 19th century, as immigration continues to explode, Congress passes many laws that have dramatic importance for immigration and for the records regarding immigration. One of the most important is that states can no longer regulate immigration, and that includes cities as well, right? So like Boston and Baltimore, they will not get to make rules about immigrants in the way that they have in the past, which we're going to talk about here in a minute. The amount of categories required on the passenger list begins to expand very rapidly until by about 1907, you have over 30 categories that have to be recorded. The final death of the customs passenger list comes in 1891, where Congress creates federal immigration stations, most famously, of course, Ellis Island in New York Harbor. And they start to take over this process as opposed to leaving it up to the customs departments. So now we're going to talk about some of the quirks of the 5 big ports that I mentioned earlier. Let's start with Boston. So Boston, all original custom passenger lists before 1883 were destroyed by fire. I'm sorry to say that you will see a lot of this as we go down the list, but fortunately, we do have some supplemental records that make up. Copies of original lists between 1820 and 1874 survive, as do State Department transcripts from 1820 to 1874. But I have to note that both sets do have gaps, though. The big supplemental record for Boston comes from the 1848 Massachusetts Alien Passenger Act, passed in 1848 in response to the gigantic waves of indigent Irish immigrants arriving in Boston at this time in response to the Great Famine. And basically, what it does is it required the captain of a ship to basically supply a copy of his passenger list, because Massachusetts had made this law basically saying that every passenger had to pay a $2 tax that, of course, would have been paid to the captain first, and then he would have to deposit it at the port of Boston to provide for immigrants that had arrived on the shores of Boston with nothing but the clothes on their back. This is basically to indemnify Boston for taking care of feeding and housing these people until they found work on their own. Right. So this is an example of an original alien passenger list. Even though it's in response to the Irish famine immigrants, it doesn't exclude, it's for all immigrants, right? So as you can note, it's pretty straightforward. You have the same general categories here, but when you're looking at the microfilm or the databases, if you're looking in Boston, more often than not, this is what you're going to see. So let's tackle the biggest one, New York City. Fortunately for us, New York City's custom passenger lists are largely complete. They include original lists, copies, and abstracts. Unfortunately, after the first version of Ellis Island opened, an 1897 fire destroyed far more detailed manifests that had been kept there, which is very unfortunate for us, but, we take what we can get. New York City is far and away the biggest immigration port. I know it's kind of a joke with genealogists, like, oh, they all come through New York. And the thing is like, obviously that's not true, but 75% of all shipboard immigrants will pass through New York City for a variety of reasons that we can get into possibly in the Q&A section. It's just the biggest port. But when you're talking about millions and millions of people, 25% of that is still, very large numbers. One unfortunate aspect of New York Customs passenger lists is that no complete published index has ever been done from 1847 to 1897, which of course is when the huge numbers, particularly of Irish and Germans, began coming over. Searchable databases online have softened this blow, and I think as time goes on, the situation will be better, but it is still a bit of a stumbling block, unfortunately. Philadelphia. Philadelphia has the greatest date range of all passenger lists, though of variable quality and usefulness. Philadelphia has some lists that date all the way back to 1727, though of course those are not customs passenger lists. Meticulous record keeping and experience means that if your immigrant ancestor landed in Philadelphia, you're very lucky because they kept very excellent records, usually very well written and organized, a real joy to look through. Baltimore. Baltimore is second only to New York in terms of the number of immigrants that come through there. However, just like Boston, almost all of the original passenger lists went up in flames in a warehouse in the late 19th century. That being said, fortunately, we could still have some of those other records I mentioned earlier that can help bridge these gaps. Quarterly abstracts are used from about 1820 to 1869. That being said, serious gaps do abound. We have a complete loss for 1842, 1846, 1847, 1851 through 1856, 1864, and 1867. Transcripts will provide some coverage for this time period. What we primarily use for customs passenger lists in this time period for Baltimore are what are known as city lists, which go from 1833 to 1866. A bit like how Boston did it, the city lists are generated from a law by the Maryland legislature that imposes a tax upon immigrants to help indemnify the city of Baltimore for taking care of the large amounts of immigrants that come to Baltimore that the city then in turn has to house and feed to keep them from starving to death, which I think we can all agree is a good thing to do, right? This is an example of a typical city list. Once again, you'll see the same bit of information. Occasionally, you'll get a bit more in there. It's pretty straightforward, but more often than not, when you're looking at the microfilm for Baltimore, this is what you're looking at. And finally, last but certainly not least, New Orleans. New Orleans' original custom lists run from 1820 to about 1903. Many of them are completely lost, especially for early years. However, we are lucky in that there are many copies that provide coverage. Before the Civil War, New Orleans was the second largest immigration port, although as the ships got larger, that ended until the late 19th century when some terraforming was done and the port was opened up. So you'll see kind of a U shape when it comes to immigration through New Orleans. Quarterly abstracts run from 1820 to 1875, while transcripts that we talked about earlier run from 1820 to 1827. Unfortunately, January through June of 1833 is completely gone, and we have no records of that whatsoever. I will say New Orleans custom passenger lists are almost certainly the hardest to deal with. They are a hodgepodge and can be extremely difficult. But, what's the fun if everything's easy? All right. How were these lists preserved and why do I care? Well, this is incredibly important. The key to success is mastering the microfilm and the databases, right? So all surviving lists, originals, copies, abstracts, and transcripts were eventually acquired by the National Archives from their various repositories. They were sorted by port, date, and ship, and that's what you're going to see on places like Ancestry and Family Search. The microfilming process took decades and was completed by about 1977. One note for customs passenger lists is that most West Coast lists were completely destroyed, except for a couple of years for San Francisco, Tacoma, and Port Washington. When you're looking through this microfilm or databases, due to human error, sometimes the microfilm contains a number of errors, such as a ship coming into Boston, which would be placed on the Baltimore microfilm. You'll also see it, though, where the ship did come in to Boston, but the document will have Port of Baltimore on it, and then it'll be scratched out, and Boston will be put into its stead because they bought large amounts of paper documents the last time they were in Boston, for example, and aren't going to waste the paper. This is the problem when you don't have standardization. Also, occasionally, the dates will be out of order on the roll. This isn't as big of a deal as it once was with the databases, but it does happen. Well, that's all well and good, but you're talking about hundreds and hundreds of reels of microfilm. How am I going to find any of this? Well, the answer is hopefully an index. So indexing really didn't start for any of these until the WPA took them in hand in the 1930s. The Works Project Administration, a New Deal program, which hired people basically to do a wide variety of beneficial historical work, including, most importantly for our purposes, they began indexing all of these various passenger lists. This is the rock upon which we stand. And I should note, they got to most everything except New York 1847 to 1897. Can't say I blame them there. So going from there, we need to talk about other indexers, the most important of which, of course, the man they call Philby. Percy William Philby started the single largest indexing project. It's still ongoing today. Many of you, I think, would probably be familiar with Philby. He started publishing an index to as many passenger names as he could find wherever he could find them. This was started in 1981, 1982. Although Philby has since left us, they have been publishing a yearly supplemental to these for, well, basically for 40 odd years now. This is also where all those books, Germans to America, Famine Immigrants, Italians to America, that's where they get their information from. It's all an outgrowth of that. Many of these books are available through places like Ancestry, but due to contracts, copyright, what have you, the latest one they have on there is 2006. And here at the Allen County Public Library, for example, we even have the 2023 supplement. So you have over 20 volumes that are not available online. Right? Now, one thing before we get into some of the more esoteric stuff, I want to show you an example on Ancestry of how these various databases are organized so that when you're doing this on your own time, you can kind of get an idea of what I'm talking about, why it's so important to understand how the microfilm is created and stored. All right, so here I am on Ancestry. So if I go to search, immigration and travel, the featured data collections, I'd like to go straight to passenger lists. And what do you know? The first 5 right here, New York, Massachusetts, which is basically Boston, Baltimore, Pennsylvania, basically Philadelphia, and New Orleans. Let's take a look at Baltimore. I always recommend to people when they're taking a look at these kinds of things, while it's great to jump in, if you browse the collection, it's going to give you an idea of what this particular database is made up of and what it's looking through. So if I look all the way down here, M255 and M596, you have Baltimore, Maryland, and then Baltimore, Maryland, 1820, 1869, the quarterly abstracts, right? As we've been talking about, they're on different microfilms, but they're included in the same database, which is very useful. But if I just take a look here, you'll be able to see like the dates that I mentioned earlier, like where they're missing and why you might be having issues finding your particular immigrant ancestor. Right? And you can see the same thing on family search as well. I will say you will have better success the more focused your search is. And if you can understand this microfilm and you can understand how it's organized, your chances of success go up dramatically. So let's head back to the old slideshow. All right, so research tips. Check multiple indexes for the same port. As we have discussed, there are a lot of complications. There's a lot of fires. There's a lot of issues. Many ports will have overlapping coverage from different records that may reveal more information depending on the kind of document that was submitted. Databases are fantastic, but it is still a human being trying to transcribe the writing. That may change in the future, but for now, it's always an excellent idea to check the original document. When you are on Ancestry, when you are on Family Search, don't rely on their transcriptions. They do not have the same skin in the game that you do. So if you take a look at the document, I know so many people that have been able to find their immigrant ancestor just because they're looking for a certain name that the indexer in question just didn't recognize. Remember to look for alternate and ethnic spellings for names. Johann for John, example. Many times when people came to the United States in the 19th century, they would change their names to either be more American or they would do the English version of whatever their name meant in English, right? So for example, you'll see lots of Schneiders who become Taylors in English because Schneider is just German for Taylor. Initials were often substituted for the whole name. I can't tell you how many times I've seen adult and children abbreviated versus an entire name. Also, finally, context is vital, right? When you are having trouble finding your particular immigrant, do some research. Try and see if they came over with family members, a wife, a brother, a husband, etc., and try looking for them. Many times I have found success because I looked for a close relative and found them in the same passenger list coming over together. Other important losses I should note: Charleston, only 1820 to 1829 were preserved, although I should note the South outside of New Orleans was never a big immigrant waypoint. Unfortunately, Galveston's records, 1872 to 1895, were completely destroyed in their horrific hurricane. More research tips. Date ranges lie. I cannot overemphasize this enough. They lie so much. These are ballpark figures. There are no complete original customs passenger lists for any port of entry. That's why the National Archives utilize so much in the way of abstracts and substitute lists to cover these gaps. The substitute lists are often in completely different microfilm collections and even databases. So, like what we saw with the Baltimore example, where you have the copies and the city lists in one and the quarterly transcripts in another. That's not always the case. And I should note, some historians think that up to 40% of all custom passenger lists have been lost. Now, most people, I would say, think that that is too high of a number. The general consensus is probably about 10% of them have been lost, but the reality of it is we simply do not know. Know what you are looking at. The various online searchable databases use these microfilm reels that were copied by the National Archives from these various collections are the exact same thing. If you know what NARA microfilm you are using, it can help answer questions of why you're not finding what you're looking for, because you may be looking in the wrong place. This also applies to various indexes, which are often listed as individual collections in online databases. And finally, this is a bit more of a general notation, but historical context matters, right? If you're having problems finding, what port they came in through, start doing research on their particular ethnic group, if you know what that is, right? See which way that, what the most likely scenario would be for them to come, for the people in that particular county, right? Maybe other people came through, say, like Baltimore or New York. Ports of departure and arrival, the time period, etc., can give you incredible clues. So if I find a German who's living in central Ohio in 1800, and I know that he probably came over pre-revolution, then he almost certainly came through Philadelphia, and he probably came from one of those southwestern German-speaking areas, right? So that could be Switzerland, Württemberg, Baden, Alsace, Lorraine, etc., because that's where the vast majority of German immigrants pre-revolution would have come in, and also filtering their way through to Ohio. Once you start to understand these kinds of things, you can start to understand potential possibilities for where those immigrants came from and where you can start your search. That's been my presentation. I think we still have some time left over for questions. So I would like to thank you all for being here today, and let's take a look and see what we have going on.
Do we know what was on volume 2, like the years, the ports?
Yes. Late 1820 going into early 1821.
You say the 97 fire in New York destroyed the most detailed manifest. Are there overlapping, if less detailed, abstracts or other abridged records from the same voyages that might have survived?
Generally speaking, no. With New York City, there were, in many ways, we're still very fortunate with New York. Immigration port by far, and most of the originals, copies, transcripts, and abstracts all managed to survive. But those particular manuscripts were something that were generated in a lot more detail by the individual ships. They were actually safely stored in Albany, but the recently opened Ellis Island demanded that they be taken to Ellis Island, so that they could check to make sure, if immigrants were, if they said that they had immigrated in such and such year, that they could check them.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, the original Ellis Island was a gigantic fire trap, to the point where the person who ran it demanded that there be a steamship that kept steam up 24/7, so that when it inevitably caught fire, uh, they could escape. And that was actually, it turned out to be a very insightful move on his part, because nobody died in the fire because they had a steamboat ready at that exact moment,
Yeah.
and were able to take all of the, all of the workers and all the immigrants off site, but which is
Yeah.
a good thing.
'Cause I don't
But
think you could
sadly,
swim that.
I wouldn't recommend it.
So there are a couple of people asking about the city list. One person
Mhm,
saying that they've hunted for them, but they can't find them. Another
mhm.
person's just asking if the city lists for Baltimore are online. Can you talk a little more about
Yep.
that?
Yeah, absolutely. The city lists are, if you check your handout, they are squished together, in both the specifically the Boston and the Baltimore microfilm reels that you will see in the databases on Ancestry or Family Search, right? They're not marked out as separate. They're uh, they're included with the whole thing, just like you will see with, more often than not, with transcripts and abstracts. When the National Archives assembled all of these microfilm reels, they organized them by port, ship, and date. And sometimes they squished them together into one microfilm reel, and other times they separated them out. But for the Baltimore city lists, they are going to be under just the Baltimore 1820 to 1890 something, whatever. And it'll be in that 1833 to 1866 period when Baltimore, or I should really say, in this case, the state of Maryland, had that legislation on the books.
Were the occasional passenger lists from the 1600s, such as Baltimore and New York, also destroyed in later fires, or just other causes, just time?
While my understanding is, and honestly, this probably belongs to a different program, a prequel, if you will, pre-federal passenger lists. Uh, there's not really any, because part of it is just state capacity. Like the colony of Virginia passed several laws saying that you had to have a passenger list, and it seems that people just largely ignored it, and there was no kind of enforcement. Uh, those that were kept were kind of kept at the discretion of the individual ship owner slash captain, and almost all of them were eventually, destroyed, pulped, used for other purposes. It's unfortunate, but it's the nature of people. Like once you get a large amount of paper documents, they don't really want to keep them around. They're big, they're bulky, and well, who's really going to want to use this stuff? If you really want to hear a heartbreaking story, you can ask what happened to what comes after the custom passenger list, the original immigration passenger lists, which were sold to a New Jersey firm and turned into pulp.
Somebody wanted to know, were passenger lists made at the ports of departure? Do we need to just look at each departure point to find the list?
So they are made at the point of departure. That is a crucial point. Certain areas, or I should say certain ports, right? Like Liverpool, Bremen, Hamburg, etc. They kept a copy too, more often than not. But for what you're talking about in this era is, I should note, Liverpool did not. Britain didn't mandate any kind of passenger list kept at the port in question until until I think like 1907, at which point it's not particularly useful. But places like Bremen, they did actually keep a copy of the passenger list. However, they were regularly destroyed on and then of course, in the late, as time went on, the copies in places like Bremen and Rotterdam and Le Havre that weren't purposefully destroyed were often destroyed by Allied bombing during World War II. So when you're looking in this time period, you're really looking at the American side.
There are a couple people asking about
Mhm.
Canada. You know,
Canada.
yes.
Yes.
They're wanting to know, how do you find Canadian passenger lists? Do they even have them? What about people who had ancestors who crossed the border?
Mhm.
Yeah, those border
Well,
crossings.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I would have to take a look at later for Canadian pass. I would have to take a look into, some of that. I would say send us an email.
Yeah, send
I
us an
will say,
email.
I will say in this time period, there, like all these ships going to Canada, the infamous coffin ships that are, winding up in Quebec and whatnot. Uh, there aren't really any.
Yeah.
It's because just like previous to the American Revolution, these are ships going from one part of the British Empire to another. So there's not really a demand, right? And of course, also it should be noted that the only reason that these custom passenger lists exist in the first place is the humanitarian aspect, right? Like the British keep it until 1846 that like for the price of an American of a ticket straight to the United States, the it you can get 5 tickets on a British ship to Canada. Uh, that being said, if they get to Canada and they cross the border, there are no real records of border crossings until the late 1890s.
1895.
1895, there we go. Because, once the Canadians and Americans realize that roughly 40% of the people, even in the 1890s, that are going to Canada are crossing the border to come to the United States, and then they decide to do something about it. But before that, your records are you're going to have to look in the places that your immigrant ancestors settled.
So somebody was asking, do you have any tips for finding Irish passengers? I think many of them came in through England. I haven't been able to find my 2 times great grandparents from Northern Ireland. Well,
Well, I was about to say, Elizabeth, you want to tag team this one?
yes.
A lot of it depends on the time period that we're talking about. If we're talking, and also depend to be blunt, it depends on the religion as well. I will say, 75% of all Irish immigrants that come to the United States will leave through Liverpool. Um, so there's but of course, when you're talking about millions of people, 25% is still a pretty big chunk of where they could come from elsewhere.
So this person said that they're Protestant. They came in 1866. So depending on where in
Interesting.
Northern Ireland, they could have left from Derry,
Yeah.
or Londonderry.
Mm-hmm.
They could have also gone from Derry to Liverpool and then
Yeah.
on. That's like the most likely scenario. My great grandmother came in many decades later, and
Yeah.
she left from Derry.
Yeah.
But still, like most people, even in the 1860s, were leaving from Liverpool, but some people would even go from Derry, stop over in Inishowen, which is like next door, and then go
Yeah.
to the United States. So I find my past is your friend.
That's an excellent point, Elizabeth. One thing I do want to mention a little bit is, immigrant traffic, just like any other kind of large scale international trade, is often like concentrated relatively quickly in a handful of places, right? So with British, you're taking a ship from Britain to the United States in the 19th century, you're almost certainly talking about getting to Liverpool and going from there. Later on, it'll change to South Portsmouth, which is to give you an idea, the Titanic, for example, even though it's built in Belfast and it sails from Portsmouth, the heart of the company is still in Liverpool, so they write Liverpool on the side of the ship, to give you an idea of just how key that particular city was to that immigrant trade. Same thing on the continent, right? Like, you can get a really good idea of, the 5 or 6 cities they almost certainly came from, given their ethnicity and the time period.
Is there any record of crew members? I have found all family except the father on a ship. Thoughts?
Not so much for this time period. Crew members will come in later through immigration passenger lists, which I'll probably end up doing a program on that as well. But you will not see as much in the way of crew members in this time period. It is pretty focused on passengers, because it is, once again, it's the humanitarian measure. It's not really designed to document people going from one place to the other. It's to make sure that they're not, locking them in a, well, relatively terrible steerage. It's all relative, though.
Well, thank you, Logan, for such a great program, and thanks everybody for tuning in. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your evening. And like I said, if we did not get to all of your questions, please, 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 please send us an email. We would like to answer your questions. So I hope everybody has a good night. Bye.
Take care, folks.